Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Greenland is the largest island on Earth that almost no one lives on. It is closer to New York than it is to Copenhagen. American bombers fly over it. American radar stations sit on it. And yet, Greenland is not American. In 1946, the United States placed the modern equivalent of $100 million in gold on the table and asked a simple question: how much for the island? Denmark said no. To understand why a small European country still owns one of the most strategic pieces of land on Earth, we have to go back to a time when Greenland wasn't strategic at all, when it was barely even habitable, and when the people who first claimed it vanished without a trace. Greenland entered European history not through ambition, but through exile. In the late 10th century, Norse sailors pushed west from Iceland after internal feuds, and land shortages made staying impossible. They were not searching for an empire or a new frontier. They were searching for anywhere they could survive. When their ships reached the ice-covered coastline of Greenland, survival, not ownership, was the only concern. The settlements they built were small and fragile. Farms clung to narrow coastal strips where grass grew briefly in summer. Churches and communal halls followed, forming societies that looked like distant echoes of Iceland. These settlers considered themselves subjects of the Norwegian king, but Norway itself was impossibly far away. A round trip could take months, and royal authority weakened with every mile of ocean. Greenland was connected to Europe by identity, not by control. This mattered because Greenland was never claimed through conquest or planning. No king ordered it settled. No borders were drawn. Greenland belonged to Norway only because the people living there believed it did. As long as they remained, that belief held. Sovereignty rested on presence, and presence was thin. For centuries, the Norse communities survived at the edge of viability. Trade was limited. Climate worsened. Contact with Europe became rare. Then it stopped. By the late medieval period, ships no longer arrived, letters no longer returned, and records fell silent. The Viking settlements disappeared entirely. No one knew exactly when it happened, only that one day Greenland was empty again. What did not disappear was the claim. No rival power arrived. No treaty reassigned the land. No one officially erased Greenland from the Norwegian realm. The island slipped out of lived experience but remained on maps and in royal titles. It became a place Europe remembered owning, even though no Europeans lived there anymore. This was the critical mistake, or the critical accident. Greenland was abandoned in practice, but never abandoned on paper. And because no one rushed in to replace that paper claim, it lingered, quiet, unchallenged, waiting. That forgotten status would prove far more powerful than any fortress or army. Because when Greenland finally returned to history, it did not return as an empty island. It returned as a claim no one had bothered to erase. When the Vikings vanished, Greenland did not become contested territory. It became something more unusual, land that no one bothered to take. For medieval Europe, absence did not automatically mean surrender. If a king had once claimed a place and no one else replaced him, that claim could simply sit there, dormant, but intact. Greenland slipped into that category almost perfectly. For hundreds of years, no European ships returned in force. Sailors reported ice, storms, and uncertainty. Rumors circulated that the old Norse colonies were gone, but no expedition was sent to confirm it. Greenland faded from experience, but not from record. On maps, it still belonged to the Norwegian crown. In royal titles, it still existed. And crucially, no one challenged that assumption. Then Scandinavian politics quietly reshaped Greenland's future. Norway entered a dynastic union with Denmark, sharing a single king while remaining legally distinct kingdoms. When the crown moved, Greenland moved with it, not because Denmark acted, but because sovereignty followed the monarch. Greenland became part of the Denmark-Norway realm without a single ship sailing west. From Copenhagen, Greenland was distant, cold, and seemingly useless. It produced no wealth, offered no military advantage, and demanded expensive voyages just to reach it. Denmark did not rush to settle or develop it, but it also did not erase it. The island remained listed among the crown's possessions, a forgotten line item that no one bothered to delete. This mattered more than anyone realized at the time. In an age when unclaimed land invited competition, Greenland's greatest protection was neglect. Because Denmark never officially gave it up, no other power could claim it was open for the taking. Ownership survived not because Denmark defended Greenland, but because Denmark never told the world it had stopped owning it. By the early 18th century, Greenland existed in a strange state. It was legally Danish, practically empty, and almost entirely absent from European life. But that quiet balance was about to break, not because of strategy or competition, but because one man decided to sail north, looking for people who were already gone. In 1721, a Danish-Norwegian priest named Hans Egede set sail for Greenland with a singular purpose. He believed the Viking settlers were still there, isolated but alive, cut off from Europe for centuries. His mission was not conquest or trade. It was rescue, spiritual and cultural, an attempt to reconnect a lost Christian community with the world they had vanished from. Egede's ship reached Greenland's coast after a brutal journey through ice and fog. What he found was not a forgotten Norse society clinging to survival. The Viking farms were gone. The churches were ruins. The people Egede met were Inuit, living on the land in ways entirely separate from Europe's medieval past. The settlers he had come to find were not hiding. They were simply gone. This moment mattered more than Egede could have known. For the first time in centuries, a representative of the Danish crown had returned to Greenland and confirmed the truth. The old European population was extinct. But instead of turning back, Egede stayed. He built a mission. He established a permanent presence. And in doing so, he transformed a legal claim into a physical one. Egede's settlement was modest, isolated, and precarious. It was not a colony in the imperial sense. There was no rush of settlers, no grand plan for exploitation. But it was enough. A flag was raised, a church was built, records were kept. Denmark was no longer claiming Greenland from memory alone. It was there again, quietly, deliberately, and visibly. The irony was sharp. Egede had gone to Greenland looking for Vikings to save. Instead, he became the reason Denmark never lost the island. His failure to find the past anchored Denmark's future. From that point on, Greenland was no longer just a forgotten name on a map. It was a place with a living connection to Copenhagen. This return changed how Greenland was treated by Europe. It was no longer assumed to be abandoned land. Denmark began to regulate trade, control access, and maintain a small but continuous presence along the coast. The island remained remote and difficult, but it was no longer invisible. Greenland had re-entered history. Not as a prize, but as a responsibility Denmark had quietly resumed. That responsibility would soon be tested, because once Greenland was no longer forgotten, it was no longer safe from being questioned, and the next challenge would not come from missionaries or merchants, but from the collapse of an empire far away in Europe. Greenland's fate was sealed not in the Arctic, but on the battlefields of Europe. In the early 19th century, Denmark-Norway was pulled into the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, a conflict that punished small states for choosing the wrong side. Denmark tried to stay neutral. When neutrality failed, it aligned with Napoleon, a decision that would cost it almost everything that actually mattered. Britain responded by attacking Copenhagen, seizing the Danish fleet, and crippling the kingdom's ability to project power. When Napoleon collapsed, Denmark found itself treated as a defeated power at the negotiating table. The price was severe. In 1814, Denmark was forced to give up Norway, ending a union that had lasted for centuries and stripping Copenhagen of its most valuable territory. Under normal logic, Greenland should have gone with Norway. Its historical connection was older, and its identity had been tied to the Norwegian crown long before Denmark inherited it. But the Treaty of Kiel did something deeply ironic. While Denmark lost Norway, a populated, productive country, it was allowed to keep Norway's distant Atlantic dependencies, Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands. At the time, this looked like a bad deal disguised as mercy. Greenland was seen as a frozen burden, expensive to reach and offering nothing in return. Sweden wanted Norway. No one wanted Greenland, and so Denmark kept it almost by default, as an afterthought tucked into the treaty's fine print. That fine print changed everything. For the first time, Denmark's claim to Greenland was not based on inheritance, assumption, or custom. It was written into an international treaty recognized by Europe's major powers. Denmark had lost a war, lost a kingdom, and yet emerged with its ownership of Greenland clarified and protected. This was history's quiet joke. Denmark lost the useful part of its realm and kept the part everyone thought was useless. What looked like punishment became a safeguard. Greenland was no longer a medieval leftover drifting through royal titles. It was a legally confirmed Danish possession, locked in place by the same treaty that dismantled the rest of Denmark's empire. Only later would anyone realize how strange that outcome really was. Because once Norway regained its independence, it would look back at that treaty and see Greenland not as a burden Denmark had been stuck with, but as something that never should have been left behind at all. When Norway became fully independent in 1905, it inherited more than a flag and a parliament. It inherited a memory. For many Norwegians, Greenland had never truly stopped being Norwegian. It had been separated by dynastic politics, not by consent, and the Treaty of Kiel was increasingly seen as an accident of defeat rather than a fair settlement. For decades, that feeling remained dormant, until international law offered a new opening. By the early 20th century, the rules of ownership were changing. States were expected not just to claim land, but to show they governed it. Greenland's vast eastern coast was empty, unadministered, and brutally inhospitable. To Norwegian lawyers and explorers, this looked like opportunity. If Denmark only governed the parts of Greenland where people lived, then perhaps the rest of the island was still up for grabs. In 1931, Norway acted carefully, politely, and without a single shot fired. A small group of Norwegian trappers and explorers landed on Greenland's eastern coast. They raised a flag. They named the region Erik the Red's Land, and they declared it Norwegian territory. It was, in many ways, the most courteous invasion in history. No army, no violence. Just a statement meant to force a legal reckoning. For Denmark, the stakes were existential. If Norway's argument succeeded, Denmark would not lose a coastal strip. It would lose the principle that Greenland was a single island under a single authority. The map of the Arctic would fracture, and Denmark's centuries-old claim would collapse. What looked like a minor dispute was, in reality, a fight over the island's future. Rather than respond with force, Denmark chose the only arena where it could win outright. The case was taken to the Permanent Court of International Justice. The argument was simple but decisive. Greenland, Denmark insisted, had always been treated as one territory. Administration did not require settlement everywhere, especially in a place where survival itself limited habitation. Intent, continuity, and recognition mattered more than population. In 1933, the court ruled in Denmark's favor. Norway's claim was rejected in full. The decision affirmed that Denmark's authority extended over all of Greenland, not just the places where people lived. The ruling was final. Norway withdrew peacefully, lowering its flag and leaving behind nothing but maps that might have been. This was the moment Greenland truly became secure. Not because Denmark was powerful, but because it had survived the most dangerous kind of challenge. A legal one. If Denmark had lost that case, Greenland today would almost certainly be divided, or entirely different in status. Instead, a courtroom decision fixed the island's fate just years before the world would plunge into another war. Denmark had won the argument, but history was about to test whether winning an argument was enough when control itself disappeared. In April 1940, Denmark ceased to exist as a sovereign state in practice. German forces crossed its borders in the early hours of the morning, and within a single day, Copenhagen was occupied. The Danish government remained, but under constraint and supervision. For Greenland, thousands of kilometers away, the consequences were immediate and dangerous. The country that owned it could no longer reach it, defend it, or even communicate freely with it. Under almost any historical precedent, this would have been the end of Danish Greenland. When a state loses control of its territory, others move in. But Greenland once again benefited from being difficult, distant, and inconvenient. Germany had no realistic way to project power into the Arctic. The island was too far, too cold, and too costly to occupy. And so, for a brief moment, Greenland existed in a vacuum. That vacuum did not last long. The strategic value of Greenland was now obvious to everyone else. Weather data from the island could decide air battles over Europe. Airfields on its coast could shorten transatlantic flight routes. Leaving Greenland undefended was not an option. The question was not whether someone would take responsibility for it, but whether doing so would replace Denmark's claim. The answer came from the United States. Although not yet fully engaged in the war, Washington moved quickly to secure Greenland's defenses. American forces built airstrips, weather stations, and supply routes across the island. Greenland became a key link in the Allied war effort almost overnight. What mattered most was how this was done. The United States did not annex Greenland. It did not declare it occupied territory. Every move was framed as temporary protection on behalf of Denmark. Greenland was defended for Denmark, not taken from it. Even while Denmark itself was under German control, its legal ownership of Greenland was respected by the most powerful country in the world. This distinction was crucial. Denmark had lost control, but it had not lost recognition. And recognition, once again, proved more important than presence. Greenland passed through the war without changing hands, even as foreign soldiers built bases across its ice. For Greenlanders, the war ended centuries of isolation. The island was suddenly connected to global logistics, technology, and power. For Denmark, the war delivered an unexpected confirmation. Its claim survived the one moment when it seemed most vulnerable. When peace returned and Denmark regained full sovereignty, Greenland returned with it automatically. Once again, the pattern held. Denmark could disappear from the island and still keep it, as long as no one replaced its claim. But the war had changed the equation permanently. Greenland was no longer a forgotten possession. It was now a strategic prize. And that reality would soon force Denmark to make the most important decision of the entire story. The war left Greenland permanently altered. What had once been a remote Arctic dependency was now a proven strategic platform. American aircraft had crossed it, American radar watched from it, and American soldiers had lived on it. Greenland was no longer valuable in theory. It had demonstrated its value in practice. And in Washington, that reality raised an obvious question. In 1946, the United States approached Denmark with an offer. It was direct and unprecedented. The proposal placed the modern equivalent of $100 million in gold on the table in exchange for Greenland. The logic was clear. Denmark had been occupied during the war. The island's defense and infrastructure had already been built by American forces. In a rapidly hardening Cold War, Greenland's position was simply too important to leave unresolved. For Denmark, this was the moment when every earlier accident of history suddenly demanded a conscious decision. Selling Greenland would have been easy to justify. The country was small, still recovering, and dependent on American security guarantees. Greenland was costly to administer and impossible to defend alone. Many states in Denmark's position would have accepted without hesitation. Denmark said no. The refusal was neither emotional nor symbolic. It was strategic. Selling Greenland would have converted centuries of continuity into a temporary arrangement that had finally expired. It would have confirmed that ownership existed only until a stronger power arrived with a better offer. More importantly, it would have reduced Greenland to a military asset rather than a place with its own people, history, and future. Instead, Denmark changed the nature of its ownership. Greenland was formally integrated into the Danish state. Greenlanders received citizenship and political representation. Over time, authority shifted away from colonial administration toward local governance. Denmark did not attempt to compete with the United States militarily. It chose legitimacy over leverage. American bases remained, but under agreement rather than transfer. Defense became a partnership, not a transaction. The United States gained strategic stability without needing to redraw the map. Denmark retained sovereignty by accepting that sovereignty in the modern world no longer meant exclusive control. This integration is why, even in the 21st century, when American leaders occasionally float the idea of buying the island again, the response remains the same: polite, firm, and final. Greenland is no longer a transaction waiting to happen. It simply isn't for sale. By the time Greenland reached the modern world, ownership no longer depended on who arrived first or who could project power the farthest. It depended on who remained when everyone else had reasons to leave. Across 1,000 years, Denmark, and before it, Norway, did exactly that. It stayed on the record when Greenland was empty, stayed in treaties when empires collapsed, and stayed in law when control slipped away. Greenland outlived the people who first settled it. It survived dynastic unions, imperial wars, and legal challenges because its claim was never replaced. Again and again, history created moments when the island could have changed hands. Each time, Denmark's position endured not through strength, but through timing. It was present when recognition mattered and absent when interference would have provoked replacement. The pattern is striking. When Greenland was useless, Denmark kept it quietly. When it became valuable, Denmark relied on legitimacy rather than force. When challenged, it chose courts over conflict. When pressured by a superpower, it chose partnership over sale. At no point did Denmark attempt to extract Greenland's value faster than it could justify holding it. That restraint turned out to be decisive. By the late 20th century, the relationship had fully inverted. Greenland was no longer Danish because Denmark ruled it tightly. It was Danish because Denmark accepted limits to its rule. Autonomy expanded, local government strengthened, and decisions increasingly belonged to the island itself. Sovereignty survived not by resisting that change, but by absorbing it. And that is the quiet resolution of the question. Greenland belongs to Denmark not because Denmark conquered it, not because it exploited it, and not because it defended it with overwhelming power. It belongs to Denmark because, across centuries of neglect, upheaval, and global transformation, Denmark was the one actor that never formally stepped away, and never forced the island to choose between submission and replacement. By the time the world understood how valuable Greenland was, its place on the map had already been decided.